Hello, hello. You guys can hear me. Hello, hello. Hopefully I'm live. I'm gonna double check myself. Yep. Hey folks. Thank you for tuning in to Sabine's Common Sense. This is my first live. So seriously, you should be proud of me. Um, Welcome to Sabine's Common Sense. I'm your host, Sabine the Purpose Lawyer. Thank you for listening and thank you for helping me be on purpose. Thank you for joining my live tonight. So just take a moment to like and subscribe. I don't beat you guys over the head with this. Just like, subscribe, follow the channel so you can watch these videos. It's good information. It really is. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about Dr. Dre's seven-figure divorce. Yes, seven-figure divorce right now. Yeah, so a seven-figure divorce. What is there to know about this? So what happened is they have been married for about 24 years, and so they have been going through a divorce for like pretty much the past 2 years. And I thought it was interesting because I've been talking a lot lately about trust, and I've also been asked about trust and divorces and how does all that work. So I thought this was a good example to kind of dig into of what's been going on. So just to let you know, um, that since they've been, married, they filed for divorce. They were married for 24 years, which was a really long time. And so there's a lot going on in this divorce. So one, he was ordered to pay millions of dollars in legal fees. And so a lot of people don't know that if you get a divorce and you are the spouse that has the more money, most likely you're going to end up paying legal fees, right? So you're going to end up paying legal fees for the spouse who has the less money. So obviously he's worth about $800 million, almost a billionaire. So he ended up having to pay her legal fees to the tune of like almost $3 million, right? But when we look at that, if you have $800 million, $3 million is not really that big of a deal. But in any event, it's a lot of money, right? His spouse is getting she's getting $300,000 a month, which is about $3.6 million a year. So that's a pretty, that's she gonna be good. Probably not as good to be married to billionaire, but still not terrible. So not only was he, required to pay $3 million, but he's also required to pay her spousal support. And spousal support is where a spouse is basically required to just help keep supporting the other spouse. And the reason behind that is because the courts don't want to take responsibility for it, right? They don't want to be the one to have to take care of that spouse if something were to go wrong. They want to make sure that that spouse is taken care of on their own. So that's why he has to pay for her, because the courts don't want to pay for her, like as if she's going to be in the poorhouse, right? She's worth $39 million, which is nothing to laugh at. I'll take it, right? She's worth 39 million, so she'll be good if anything happens. But what's interesting is she wanted $2 million a month, right? $2 million a month is what she asked for, but that's normal. Like, you go through a divorce situation, they both have really high price, high powered attorneys who have, a bunch of experience and high profile cases behind them. So of course it's going to be where they ask for an exorbitant amount and see what they get, right? So anyway, she got $300,000 a month, which is a good allowance. And here's the real tea, though, that I think is interesting, that he's actually suing her for what is it, 350 million, because they had a business together. And in the business that they had together, she allegedly had spent almost, or she took all the money out of the account. That's what the media tells us, right? She took all the money out of the account, And when she took all the money out of the account, this basically she stole it, right? She stole the money, and now she's being sued for that money. But it's like, okay, whether it happened during the marriage, or did it happen when the divorce started, or did it happen when the divorce was being anticipated? So because of that, it depends on what the outcome is really going to be of that, right? Obviously it's a whole lawsuit, but depends on what the outcome is going to be. Is she going to actually have to pay that money back? Is it being used as a bargaining tool, because now that she's able to bargain, he's able to bargain and say, well, I got this lawsuit, you sold this money, and because you stole this money, let's see how we're going to settle things among us, right? So it's usually like something that they use as a bargaining tool. So that's really crazy, right? That now that they're suing each other, they're going back and forth to court, and the assets are all up in the air. So one of the things that's also interesting about this case is that they actually did have a prenup. And a lot of times people think that if you have a prenup, that it means that, you just walk away with what you came with. I just walk away with what I came with, and it's clean. But as we know, a prenup is a contract. So when you sign a contract with somebody, you basically have everything that you guys have agreed to is in writing, right? It details everything that you guys have agreed to. But because of the fact that a contract has to be interpreted, or can be interpreted or misinterpreted, I should say, because of that, it's very easy to say, well, actually, that's not what I agreed to. Or actually, we want the court to decide who gets what, or we want the court to decide this, particular clause. So, what normal people probably would do who don't have millions of dollars to fight each other is to say, okay, this is, what we agreed to. This is what it says. Let's come to an agreement, and let's, both part ways. But because they have millions of dollars to fight each other in court, she's saying that he tore up the contract. He tore up the prenuptial agreement and said that he wasn't going to enforce it. And he's like, nah, like, no, this is the prenup. And what their prenup says, so again, a prenup is a contract. So it's a contract that kind of says what's going to happen during this marriage if it dissolves. So what happens if you go your way, if I go my way, and the marriage dissolves, right? And so the prenup is usually going to say what you get, what the person gets. In their case, the prenup said that they each, whatever they make during the marriage, is theirs, right? So prior to the marriage, um, typically by law, what you had coming into the marriage is yours, and what you make during the marriage is joint. But a prenup will say if you want something different other than that, right? Because we know marriage is a contract. So when you enter into a marriage, you're agreeing to live together, you're agreeing to own everything together, essentially create a life together. And so you become one. If you don't want that, then you do have to sign a prenup to basically say, listen, although this is what normally happens when you get married, what I want to do is something very different. I want to make sure that we keep what we earn during the marriage. So that's what Dre and his now, I guess you can say, ex-wife, essentially. That's what they did. And so she's saying no for some reason. Of course, they're going to argue. She's going to argue for it, but she's saying no. Actually, I should be getting more. I should be getting, I don't know if she wants half or what have you, but she wants more than what the prenup says that she should get. The other thing about their prenup is that she didn't waive support. So she gets to get spousal support. She gets to be supported with maintenance. And that's why she has that. That's why she got that $300,000 a month. And that's only temporary. So while they settle, right, while they decide what's going to happen with all the assets, the courts always put something temporary in place. So they're like, okay, since we can't figure out everything right now, we're going to look at the information that we have, and we'll put something temporary in place. And that's usually some sort of temporary agreement. So they just awarded her 300,000 for now. She could get more. She could get more after the dust settles, because the prenup does say that she's not waiving her rights to support, and her support is essentially for life, because she gets that $300,000 a month, or $3.6 million a year. as long as she doesn't remarry and as long as she doesn't basically move in with somebody, right? So if she lives with somebody else, then she doesn't, no longer gets her support, which that has to be some guy, some guy for you to give up that $3.6 million uh, a year. But the interesting thing is that she ain't broke. So she got her own money and I'm sure she has her own business ventures. So she'll be fine. We're not crying for her. Right? So the other thing is that a prenup definite actually just covers, what happened. So they had two children, and typically a prenup will probably say, but you're still going to take care of the children, you're still going to take care of child support and things like that. But the children are grown, so they're over 18, over 21. One of them is, yeah, they're over 21, I believe, or at least over 18. And so that being the case, kids don't need that type of support when they are adults. And so they won't really need to be supported in that way. And so we're really just talking about her, what type of support she gets, and what type of what are the assets that she's going to be entitled to when the dust settles with all of this. And so, how does this play into a trust? Like, what does a trust have to do with all of this? Or if they had a trust, which I don't know if they do or not, how do you now separate your assets once you have put both of your assets in a trust? So when I deal with married couples, they typically will plan together, which makes a lot of sense, right? For the most part, if you don't have um, the level of assets that they have, or if you don't have a lot of assets that you had coming into the marriage on your own, or separate property is what we call it, then it typically makes sense to just plan together, right? And if the families want to build their wealth together, then it makes sense to build their wealth together. Now, sometimes when they have, a lot of assets that were separate, it's a little bit riskier to put all of your assets combined inside of the trust. Why? Because even if you had separate property coming into a marriage, and typically separate property is treated as being just yours. So you come in with your separate property, you leave with your separate property. But there are some things that you can do to make that pretty much a mess, right? You can mess that up because you can do what's called commingling. And if you commingle your assets, right? So, say you had an inheritance from your family and you somehow put your wife on that bank account. Well, guess what? That's now her money, right? Or vice versa. Or if you had a property that, property or properties or businesses that you came into the marriage with, and you now put that spouse's name on those assets. Well, guess what? That's now their joint asset, right? So you can't do those type of things and still want to maintain the individuality or separateness of those assets. They have to be they have to continue to be joint. And so, if you want to keep that separate, what's usually recommended is to not put them both in a trust together, but to do separate trusts. If you have a lot of separate assets, or you think that it might be risky or you might not be able to keep them separate, it's better to put them in separate trusts. And so, what is a trust in the first place? Let's back up and go there. So, a trust is basically it's another agreement, right? It's all about agreements today. So, a trust is another agreement. It's like a contract, right? And the contract has all these rules on how you're supposed to treat these assets. And what you're essentially doing is giving your trust the responsibility or the authority to take the same actions that you would be able to take over your property, to buy your property, own your property, transfer your property, mortgage your property, deal with your bank accounts, your stock accounts, etc. So your trust is getting all of this authority to do this, right? And the reason why you use a trust is because if you were to pass away, being that the trust now owns these assets, whoever you put in charge of that trust is going to be called your trustee. That person actually gets to walk out those rules. They have the authority to do what you said needs to be done with those assets. And that's good because it avoids a lot of things. It avoids the whole court process. It avoids having all of your assets public. there's a lot of good things that come into putting your assets into a trust. One of the major things is that there's no delay. So if you pass away, you got businesses, you have family that needs to be taken care of. Now, whoever's running your trust can just jump right in and do what needs to be done with your trust assets, right? So that's what a trust is, right? It's called a testamentary document. It allows you to pass on your assets. And now the whole point in putting your assets into a trust is so that the trust can actually own it. Why it's good for married couples to have separate trusts if they have a lot of separate property that they want to keep separate is because it keeps you from commingling, like what I explained, right? It keeps you from putting those assets together and getting confused as to who owns what, because your trust owns your assets, her trust owns her assets, or vice versa. And 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 then and because of that, there's no way that you're going to mix accounts or add someone's name onto the asset or what have you. So it's a good way to keep things separate. And so if they had a trust and he had all his separate assets into his trust and she had her assets in her trust, it would help to further distinguish like who owns what, right? And it makes a lot of sense when you have that type of situation. But a prenup is also a good tool to like accompany that. So I had a client come to me and say, I just inherited all this money, and I'm about to get married, and I want to know, what should I do? Should I get a trust? Should I get a prenup? And I was like, you pretty much need both, right? You need both because the trust is going to protect what you already have, and things that you acquire, you can continue to place them into your trust for your trust to control it. But if you don't have a prenup, those items that you put in your trust once you got married can be contested or challenged by your spouse, because essentially it could be their asset too. That's number one. Number two, you cannot disinherit your spouse, right? You cannot say that I want to, like, if you're going to pass away, you do a will or a trust, and you say, I don't want my spouse to get anything, nothing. It's all for me. Or it's all for, whomever. If you had a second marriage and you have, your children outside of the marriage or whatever, you if you want to say that I don't want to give my spouse anything, I'd want all of my assets to go to, whoever. Your spouse can challenge that because they have what's called an elective share. Different states call it different things, but essentially it's that you cannot leave them nothing. So each state says how much you have to give your spouse. Some states say it's 30%, it's 50%. Some states say it's a dollar amount plus a third or what have you. So whatever that is, that spouse can get if it's your assets. If it is assets that were supposed to be joint and you just somehow put them into your trust, then now that's really risky for two reasons. So one, because it was joint property and you put it in your trust, now you could have commingled your joint assets with your separate property. Isn't that crazy? So you could accidentally do that, right? So a prenup would now help to further clarify what belongs to who, right? So the prenup would say, we came into this marriage. So this is what happened in Dre's situation. We came into this marriage. What you get is yours. What I get is mine. And when we walk away, that's what's going to happen. And so coupling those two things together, your trust being before the marriage and, during the marriage, but having the prenup also to clarify what everything is would definitely, help. And so and it also depends on how the trust was created, right? So it depends on if the trust was created by you during your lifetime, right? And it depends on the type of trust. So if you created a trust by you during your lifetime and it's a revocable trust, then you're able to make changes to that trust and everything like that. But it also does not necessarily protect you from divorce situations, right? Like I said, could be your spouse's assets that you put in there. Your spouse could say, well, you got this much income coming from the trust. So that income I'm entitled to. Because remember, I said things that you had before is yours, but income is something that always comes over time. You're always getting income on, whatever assets are producing income. And so, although they may not be able to get the asset that's in the trust, they can ask for the income that's being produced for that trust. So I was saying it depends on how the trust is created. If it's created by you during your lifetime, is there's a lot less protection there, unless it's an irrevocable trust. But it also depends on what assets you put in that trust and whether that trust can be reversed. I don't want to get you too confused with too much information, but that's pretty much what that is. The other thing is that there is actually a better way to have trust protection and actually protect you from divorce. However, is you can't do it yourself, right? But you could do it for your children, or your parents could do it for you, right? So what it is if your parent creates a trust for you and leaves the assets to you in trust for life, right, for the rest of your life, then you're able to receive the income from all of those assets that are in the trust, but you don't never actually get the trust itself, the trust assets itself. So, for example, your parents leave you, a multi-million dollar property in a trust. They leave you a couple $1 million, maybe from life insurance or whatever. And so they pass away. Their trust is now irrevocable. Trust can't be changed. They put the assets in trust to you for life. So that means they're not giving you those assets, but whatever income it generates, if the money is invested, you get the income. If there's rental income from the property, you get that income every month. And so that what you're benefiting from is yours. Now, if you were to get divorced, the spouse now would not have any right to the property, the millions of dollars, or what have you. But the income that you're getting could be counted towards, whatever you're worth, essentially. But they can't get the assets. Again, that's not something that you could create for yourself, but that is something that a parent can create for you, or you can create for your kids. That's a really good way to protect assets from divorces. So now we know Dre was not a trust fund kid at all. He came from very humble beginnings. But if in the case that his $800 million came from a parent and he was a trust fund kid, there's no way that she was going to get any of that money. So you could just see how much more protection that something like that sort of gives you versus things that you can create for yourself. But it still makes sense to create things for yourself because like for instance, Dr. Dre was in the hospital last year. I don't know if he was suffering from COVID or what, but during their divorce had already started. He was in the hospital, and had he passed away, who knows what would have happened with his assets, right? I don't know if they were actually at the point where they were legally sort of separated, or if they were still married and maybe she would have still gotten everything. But if you put things in a trust and you sort of, at that point, he could have said, okay, if my assets are in a trust, let me change the beneficiary of my trust. The beneficiary is the person who's going to receive the assets from your trust. So he could have said, let me change the beneficiary of my trust to, whatever, my children, so that she doesn't get everything if I die, if you're in the middle of a divorce, essentially. And so that could have been something that could have been done. And now for couples who are planning together, right? They're planning together, they didn't do separate trusts, or they don't see the need to do separate trusts, and they put all their assets together in the same trust. Now, if they were to get divorced, then what will happen is if the trust is created properly, what happens is the assets that you put in keep the same characteristics that they already had before, right? So your trust should state that. It needs to state that, okay, that the characteristics, like if this was my property and I put it in, and I was the only name on it. When I put it in, I transferred it into the trust. If I'm taking it out, it's just mine. It's not ours. So the trust doesn't actually commingle your assets, but it could be tricky if you put them all in the same trust, how it's created, because typically if you're planning together, you're co-trustees, so you're both responsible for those assets. And if you're co-trustees and you're both responsible for those assets, you both can have access to those assets. So it's a little bit more tricky, it's a little bit more murky, and things could be thrown into court again. Like I said, although they have a prenup, it's still being thrown into court. So, Proven Winner says, how long do you have to be married to pay legal fees in a divorce? I don't. There's really not a length of time. It's typically going to be, unless it's an annulment where you've been married so short a period of time that you're just going to be able to part ways easily. Then then it's typically not a period of time that you have to pay legal fees. It could have been a year, and if there are legal fees, if there's arguments to be made, then the person with more money is going to tend to pay the legal fees, right? Um, B. Francis says, can you be a trustee and a beneficiary of a trust? Can you be a trustee? And yes, you can. You can be a trustee and a beneficiary of a trust. It depends on what your goal is for that trust. So certain types of trusts you cannot be the trustee and the beneficiary. So like if it's an irrevocable trust, you can't be the trustee or the beneficiary. Okay. So it just depends on the type of trust, what your goal is with that trust, um, etc. And then but most likely, like if it's a revocable trust, you can certainly be the trustee and the beneficiary. Um, yeah. Yeah, so this was, I thought, was an interesting conversation to have with regards to divorce, in regards to to trust and how sort of your assets are treated. So some other assets that I didn't talk about was if in case that you had your life insurance policy, you guys have a joint trust, you have your life insurance policy going to the trust. So you have the trust as the beneficiary of your life insurance. And what now happens to that? So really to undo that, you just have to change your beneficiary. That's like the easiest way to do it, is to change your beneficiary to take it out of that trust. And then you can create a whole nother trust. Same thing with your retirement accounts, same thing with your investment accounts. Unless they're titled in the name of the trust directly, you can just take them out or retitle them and put them in a different trust, or put them in, back into your name, or change the beneficiary to your loved one. Typically, you don't want to just change it to your loved one because you're undoing the planning that you did, to protect those assets. And so you may want to just create separate trusts so that you guys can go your own separate ways. If there are no Yeah, if there's no other questions, I'm going to start to wrap up. Some of the things that you want to think about when you're thinking about, how is my trust going to treat these assets now that I am getting a divorce, if you're getting a divorce. So what some of the things to look at is, what does the trust say? Does the trust actually say that your assets are going to be kept separate, or that it's going to be both of your assets once it's put in here? You definitely want to be clear on that. What are the rules that you guys set up for that trust, and whether that spouse is going to get everything when you pass, or how is it actually going to be distributed? And what does it say about each asset? Does it say like the house is going to be ours, but the bank accounts will be separate? Or, the investment accounts are ours, but, the properties are separate. So it just depends on what your trust actually says. So that's what we talked about. We talked about what it said, what your trust says, who was it created by, and what actually happens with a prenup versus a trust. Like, what exactly do you need? I hope this was helpful for you guys. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching Sabine's Common Sense. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. All right. If you haven't already, and don't forget to use your common sense. If you don't have any, please feel free to use mine.